So last year, the UN celebrated its 70th anniversary, and there were lots of parties and things at the UN. But if you think back to 1945, I'm sure you all know your history, that was right after the Second World War. And so there were 48 countries who came together at San Francisco, and they really wanted to prevent a third world war. So they worked together to set up the United Nations. And they set up the United Nations with 4 purposes. The first purpose, as you can see, is to maintain peace and security. The second is to develop friendly relations among nations, keeping in mind equal rights and the self-determination of peoples. Those are 2 very important aspects of developing friendly relations. The third was to achieve international cooperation on issues that are international in their scope. So a recent one is climate, the whole climate issue, which we'll be talking more about. But certainly there's been the Ebola crisis, and now we have a new virus. So there have been lots of issues on which the United Nations has been involved in trying to help nations cooperate to meet these international problems. And then the fourth goal is to harmonize the actions of the states. So there may be many people who are interested in solving the Ebola crisis, but who's going to coordinate them? And that's the purpose of the UN, one of the purposes of the UN. So what kind of structure did they set up in order to achieve this? Well, as we look at this, you can see there's the International Court of Justice, which is The Hague, which is in Geneva. And you may have heard, I don't know how much you watch the news, but there was a person on trial yesterday at The Hague for war crimes. Then, of course, there's the Security Council, and its job is to prevent war. Do you know how many members are on the Security Council? There are 5 permanent members and 10 that are elected for 2-year terms. Next question, who are the 5 permanent ones? Yes?
United States, Russia, China, Great Britain, France.
Very good. You go to the head of the class, right? Okay, so, and they've been meeting. You know, some of their meetings are webcast, and one of them that I listened to had to do with the whole situation in Syria. And you listen to the states present their position, and you think, how are we ever going to come to any kind of agreement? But most of the negotiating goes on outside the meetings. But they hear each other and know what their positions are, and then they can talk to one another and see how they can cooperate. And there are now 193 countries. Remember, I said there were 48 70 years ago. So it has grown greatly. And that's partially due to this international trusteeship system, which helped those countries that had been colonized to actually become independent and have their own government. Then there's the Economic and Social Council, and this is where the NGOs and the social societies do their work. So I'm an executive director for the Partnership for Global Justice, which is a non-governmental organization, an NGO with status, DPI status, and ECOSOC status. And we'll come back to some of that a little bit, but that's where religious and other groups really have their impact. It's in the Economic and Social Council. And then, of course, there's the Secretariat. Who's the Secretary General? Right, Ban Ki-moon. And his term is about up, and so there's a lot of talk about whether it's time for a woman. So that would be very interesting because all of the Secretary Generals have been male up to this point. Okay, another term that you may hear that is confusing to many people is missions. So countries that are permanent members have what they call a mission at the UN. Now, if you go to the UN building and you look across First Avenue, you may see this huge building that houses the United States mission. Some mission residences are very small, some are very large. And our ambassador is Samantha Powers. And so she heads up the diplomatic team that represents the United States at the UN. Then also the NGOs, which I mentioned a little bit before. And just to clarify, there are about 4,000 NGOs with DPI status. DPI stands for the Department of Public Information. And so if you have DPI status, your responsibility is to take information from the United Nations and take it to your members throughout the world. And if you have ECOSOC status with the Economic and Social Council, your responsibility is to get information from your members all around the globe and feed it into the United Nations in order to help them make decisions. Sometimes we're told that the NGOs are the watchdogs of the UN, because when governments come together, as you can well imagine, there's a little bit of peer pressure. And so every government wants to look very good in the eyes of other governments. And so sometimes maybe they don't quite tell the whole truth. That's where the NGOs come in, because we have members in every country who are on the ground trying to help the people in that country that have needs. And this is particularly true of religious congregations, as you can well imagine. Being here at St. Francis College, you know that there's, maybe you don't know, but there's Franciscans International. And they really try to help to bring, for instance, the plight of the poorest of the people around the globe to the attention of the people at the UN. The position of NGOs, or civil societies, has also been highlighted by those who attended the Paris Climate Summit. And I'll talk more about that when I get to that point. But we were told at a briefing that the agreement would not have come to be if it had not been for the NGOs and the civil societies. So if you ever think, you know, maybe you don't get these, but I get lots of emails to sign a petition or to be part of a march or to do something. If you think that doesn't have an impact, you are wrong. It does. They listen, and if there are enough people signing those, they will listen to what the people are saying. So how does the UN affect you? Why in the world should you be interested in it? I mean, it's great. All these countries, 193 of them all over the globe. But what about you here in Brooklyn Heights, whatever? How does it affect you? Anybody? Have you ever felt that your life was affected by the United Nations?
Well, we're not at war.
Okay, we're not at war. We've been on the brink of a world war many times, and so the United Nations has been able to negotiate those. And of course, they have these peacekeeping troops in various countries that are helping to keep the peace. Do any of you ever fly internationally? So how do you think the pilots and the air traffic controllers can communicate with one another? Okay? Who set up the protocol? Well, the United Nations. Do you use the internet to get information from other parts of the world? Yes. Well, you know, the United Nations had a part in setting that up, because the United Nations is the only place where all these states being governments, as we would think, not states as in the United States, where they come together and can work together to achieve something. So as I mentioned earlier, they've had a lot of success in some of the healthcare issues. You know, fighting malaria, fighting polio, and then with Ebola. So there's a lot that goes on that affects you sort of indirectly. It keeps us safe, and maybe we don't really realize how much other people are doing to keep us safe. So here I just mentioned a few examples, and so we'll just move on from there. So they've also been promoting development. And this is interesting. How many of you have heard of the Millennium Development Goals? Oh, very good. So the MDGs. Now, when did they get approved? In what year? Millennium Development Goals were approved in 2000. And they went till 2015. We're now in 2016. So the question that started to be raised in 2012 was, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen after the Millennium Development Goals? Do we need goals? Well, the member states decided yes, they needed goals because it holds governments to some kind of goal, task, whatever. In 2007, I was in Tanzania, and that's when the Millennium Development Goals were really being implemented. They were starting to build schools so that every child would have an elementary education. Now, we sort of take that for granted in the United States, but there were probably 50 to 60% of the children in Tanzania that did not get an elementary education. They also had set up a quota for how many females should be in their parliament so that they could start to move towards some gender equality. So countries did take these goals seriously. And while they were not all achieved, there certainly was a reduction in the percent of people living in extreme poverty. I just stuck this in here because I know that you probably represent various majors. The UN is involved in everything. And I sort of knew that before I came here last April, but I can't believe all the things that the UN does. So if you're studying something, just out of curiosity, you might go out and see if you could Google or Bing or whatever you use and find how the UN is involved in that particular issue. In fact, I would challenge you that if you find something the UN is not involved in, contact me and we'll see if indeed they are or if they should be and if there's something we could do about it. Because we do have people who are engaging in research and want to get more involved with the research they're doing to present it at the UN. So if there's an area that the UN is not involved in, then maybe we need to see what we can do to move that forward. I think this is just kind of an aside, but kind of gives an idea of how they're involved in things. There's even an International Toilet Day. Well, and I know we all kind of like, you know, what, but if you've been any place in a developing country, for instance in Kenya, in the slums, they talked about the flying toilet. And what was that? A person would have their regular movement, put it in a bag, and then they'd throw it. And so if you happened to be in the path of it, it would land on you. So there is a great need for sanitation around the world. And it's easy to take what we have for granted, I guess, until you really find out what other people do not have. Okay, so back to the MDGs. As I said, they were not completely achieved, but as the UN did a serious evaluation, it helped them to come up with what would be the goals for the next 15 years. So the goals for 2030 are called the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable because the member states have come to realize that in the past many times development took place, but it took place in a way that harmed the environment. And we cannot continue to have social development and other types of economic development and ruin the planet on which we live. So it has to be sustainable. Okay, so I want to see how did they come about? Well, I don't know if you've heard of Rio Plus 20. I don't know how much to assume. I don't want to insult you, but I also want you to know that Rio Plus 20 took place in 2012. And so the member states were thinking ahead to what's going to be in place after 2015. And they decided at that they would give themselves a mandate, which you can read here, that they would have an inclusive and transparent intergovernmental process open to all stakeholders with a view to developing global sustainable development goals to be agreed by the General Assembly. So inclusive and transparent, the whole world, intergovernmental, all of the stakeholders. That's us, as well as governments and NGOs, it's individuals. It was quite a huge undertaking. So through their various resources, they set up what was called My World Survey. And they asked people around the globe, what kind of a world do you want to live in? Okay? From these issues, choose the 6 issues that matter the most to you and your family. So I'm going to give you a little time just to look at those and see if you can pick out the 6 that you think are most important. And then I'll tell you how people your age in the United States, what they selected. I'm going to show you what young people in the United States, and the UN considers young people up to the age of 30 or 32. For this, it was up to the age 30. And they took those who had completed elementary school. And you may say, why didn't they take those who had completed secondary? Well, throughout the world, as I said earlier, many children, many young people were not even completing elementary. So to say secondary would have limited it very much and would have been probably primarily developed countries. So these are the issues that young people here in the United States chose. And you may or may not have those in your top 6, but this helped to influence what became part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So as they got that data, you can imagine this is a huge amount of data, people all over the world. So then what were they going to do with it? Well, there were meetings, okay? As those of you who are here who are faculty know how hard it is sometimes to get faculty to agree on something and how it takes meetings. You can imagine at the UN with the various cultures, the various languages, and how they're going to come to some kind of agreement. So I just put this up here to give you some idea of a few of the meetings that took place. That's not all of them by any means. But as a result of that, they did come up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I hope that this video I have is going to be able to be played.
We can be.
We must be the first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
most determined
to fight injustice
and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan
For everyone.
Everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world
where nobody
anywhere
lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
where no one
Wakes in the morning asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world where no child has to die
From diseases we know how to cure.
And where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world
where everyone
goes to school. And education gives us the knowledge
and skills
For a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
and be powerful
and safe.
we cannot succeed if half the world is head down.
We will live in a world
Where all people can get clean water.
and proper toilets
At home,
at school
and at work.
We will live in a world
where there is sustainable energy for everyone.
Heat, light,
And power for the whole planet.
without destroying the planet.
we will live in a world where economies prosper.
And new wealth.
Leads to decent jobs.
For everyone.
And we will live in a world
Where our industry
Our infrastructure and our
Best innovations.
Are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
We will live in a world
Prejudices and extremes of inequality
are defeated.
Inside our countries,
And they train different countries.
Where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
And support everyone who lives there.
where we replace
What we consume. Planet where we put back what we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back the threat of climate change.
where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
will restore and protect
life on land.
The forests.
Animals, the earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
Where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
Where all countries and we their people.
Work together.
Partnerships of all kinds.
To make these global goals a reality.
These are the United Nations global goals.
For sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
So you notice that many of the people in that, many of the speakers were people probably your age. And some people have said that the Sustainable Development Goals are the goals of the youth. They're really for you, because if we don't help to maintain our planet, where will you be in 30 years, 15 years even, okay? Okay, when they developed the goals, they also developed icons for each of the goals. And indeed, you can go on the internet and you can see these icons. And actually, we're free to use them, so that, like when we had something on climate action not too long ago, they put a little one of those icons in every one of our places, and I think it could be taken off and put on a window or whatever, but I've been kind of carrying it around. Okay, you may remember last fall, I hope you remember, that the Pope came to New York. And when he spoke to the UN. And of course, when the Pope or the President comes and speaks, they speak to the General Assembly. But he also had, just before that, published his encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And the Partnership for Global Justice has a monthly newsletter. And in that newsletter, in an earlier month, we put together kind of a correlation of Pope Francis' titles in his encyclical and the Sustainable Development Goals. So really the Pope is calling us to the same things that the UN is calling us to. The world is really coming together in sensing the need for some sustainable development progress. Okay, now we're going to focus in on Goal 13. Eric asked me if I would focus more on kind of the climate issue and COP21 and what happened recently. So this is Goal 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Okay, so you can read the first target. Under each goal there are certain targets. And the first target talks about to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. Does that have any meaning for you? Can you think of anything that happened in this area recently or in the last couple of years that makes this very critical? Snowstorm, yeah. So, and were you prepared? Well, I don't know. I saw Queens on the TV and it didn't look like we were so prepared. I thought Long Island was better prepared, but only where I lived, some of the places in Long Island didn't seem to be prepared either. And then if you look back, you know, Sandy, and what are we doing to try and make sure that our country is more resilient to such types of natural disasters? And what's going on in California? If you've watched the news and seen those houses falling into the ocean, you know, what are we doing so that we will be able to respond to such calamities? Okay. Okay, the second thing is integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. Can anyone tell me something that President Obama has done recently that fits in that category? Yes.
The negotiation with China with the carbon emissions.
That's right. Did everybody hear what he said? Can you say that a little louder, please?
It's relations to China, the carbon emissions to reduce its, both countries reduce its carbon emissions by, I forgot the date.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that was key in terms of getting the climate agreement in Paris. Also, he has said that there will not be any more new rights to mine coal on federal lands. And of course, coal is one of the great producers of carbon emissions and smog. And then improve education, awareness raising. Well, that's what we're trying to do here, right? And there are many opportunities to do that. And you may notice, if you watch some of the news programs, that there is more of an effort. I heard the other day that San Diego has pledged itself to be completely carbon-free by, I think, 2030, or maybe it's even before that. So is this interest in climate change a new issue for the UN? You think so? What do you think? How many of you think it's a new issue? The sun's I don't see any hands. Obviously, therefore, you think it's been around for a while. Well, actually, in 1979, before you were born, what did they say, before you were even a beam in your mom and dad's eye, that there was the first World Climate Conference in Geneva, Switzerland. And then, from then, there were another annual activities. And in 1997, the parties present committed themselves to the Kyoto Protocol, which was also to limit carbon emissions. And it was legally binding for those who signed it. And you notice, the United States did not sign it, much to the chagrin of many of us. Why do you think the United States did not sign it? Have any of you studied the Kyoto Protocol or know anything about that enough? Here's one.
I really haven't read it, but just to take a guess, one of the protocols didn't have to do with oil or something? Or...
That could be, but I think that's not the main reason that they didn't sign it. It's legally binding. How does anything become legally binding in the United States? It has to pass Congress. And where has the bottleneck been relative to climate change? Now, I don't know what your party affiliation is, etc. But even while the meeting was going on in Paris, Congress was bad-mouthing and saying we didn't have to worry about climate change. Now, whether you believe that it's due to humans or not, you surely have to say that the climate has changed, okay? That there are many more severe natural disasters. And so we can put our head in the sand, so to speak, and refuse to respond, but we have to do something. So that's why, as we go along, I will also tell you that the Paris Agreement is not legally binding, which bothers a lot of people, but it's the only way that the United States can sign on to it. Because at this point, it doesn't seem that Congress would approve it if it was legally binding. Okay, so this COP21, it's the annual conference of parties. So it was the 21st meeting of all the member states. And in 2013, they decided that France would host this. So you see how things have to be decided in advance. And many times, especially when we're young, and sometimes when we're not so young, we get very impatient with the UN because it takes so long to move anything along. But, you know, it's a huge group. Every country has its own independence. The UN has no authority to make any country do anything. They have to voluntarily agree. And of course, countries bring pressure on one another. But Ban Ki-moon cannot walk in to the General Assembly and say, you will do this. He can only encourage, cajole, try to get them to see the need for it, and sometimes that takes a long time. So what was the goal for COP21? Well, I have it up there, and you can see, and you may have heard more about this, it's to keep the global warming below 2 degrees centigrade. So how did the UN then go about trying to achieve this? Well, they had every country commit or submit its intended nationally determined contribution. And you can go out and you can read the United States INDC. There's one thing you learn about the UN, everything is shortened to an acronym. So, you know, it's the INDC. So you can go out and Google it and you can see what we have committed ourselves to. Now, when they took all of these INDCs from all of the countries, they did not amount to keeping the global warming below 1.5. In fact, it was at 3 degrees centigrade. That would be better than it's been happening, but even at that, it's too much for the world to absorb. So, the United States has said that we will cut our emissions by 26 to 28%. One thing about the Kyoto treatment protocol, it was aimed mainly at the developed countries. And, you know, if you travel, if you do service, I don't know if you go to other countries, the developing countries, as they start to come online with more efficient types of serving their people, development, I said to people in Tanzania, don't repeat the mistakes we made. You know, find ways to do things that are sustainable. And so it's important in this next agreement that everybody is involved, not just the developed countries, but also the developing countries. So the UN collected all these INDCs and put them together and reported back. Then, since France was hosting the meeting, they did a lot of negotiations behind the scenes. And really, this is how it happens. You know, if they hadn't had all these negotiations, all these meetings beforehand, they never could have achieved what they achieved in the 2 weeks when they were in Paris. If you ever get into a leadership position, you will know that you never take something to a vote until you're sure you've negotiated enough to have assurance that you have a support group that will help to pass it. So a lot of governing is really what goes on in meetings. Sometimes people say by the water cooler or the coffee break, or whatever it is, but you have to talk to other people. And somebody mentioned this agreement between the United States and China, and that was really historic because China had never agreed before to limit its emissions. Some people said that what helped the talks in Paris was the fact that there was an inversion and that the air was so terrible in China and in India during that conference that nobody could deny the fact that something needed to be done. So maybe the climate itself helped us a little bit. Also, the participation of the NGOs, the civil societies, as I had mentioned. This was so important. The permanent representative to the UN from France, when he gave his briefing, said that the agreement would never have happened if it hadn't been for all the marches that took place around the globe on the Sunday before the conference started. And this is a picture from marching around the New York City Hall. I was there. Was anybody else there? Good, good. So, you know, it's important that we do those things, even though sometimes it's like, oh, it's cold today and I have to come in all the way from Bethpage and da-da-da-da-da. I spend 2 hours coming and 2 hours going for an hour. But it's important, very important. So I encourage you to continue any advocacy that you do. Also at that meeting, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which is GCCM, presented 1.8 million signatures. This also was very impressive. And of those, over 840,000 were the Catholic faithful. So when they got to Paris, there was a lot of passion and a lot of urgency. And that's what kept them going, because as you may have heard on the news, or you can well imagine, there were times when they really thought, we're not going to get an agreement. It's just not going to be possible. But because of their passion and because of the presence of many people from what we call the small island countries that are being overwhelmed by the ocean, you know, and they're presenting their concerns, and other people, there are a lot of side events at any of the UN meetings. So you not only have the official people who are meeting, but you have all these other people who are advocating, and you have their displays, and who are talking to one another, and who talk to the representatives or the delegates when they come out. And so it's just a major, major kind of interaction taking place. So they did finally come to an agreement. You may remember they had to extend the conference another day. And so these are the major points of the Paris Agreement. And I don't want to read those to you because you can all read. But, you know, for the first time, 193 nations agreed to make this a coordinated global effort. That is no small accomplishment. And they agreed to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is also a major step. They considered the effect on poor people, and they agreed to a 5-year review. Now you may say, why 5 years? Well, if you remember, the Kyoto Protocol ends in 2020, so they wanted to have that time. So this was a true cause for celebration. You know, it was great. We finally got this agreement, and people were dancing and singing and doing all kinds of things. They were so excited. So, let me ask you a few questions. Did the Paris Agreement achieve all that it set out to do? All that was hoped, you think?
Well, I think I was reading somewhere that some scientists are saying that even with it, it might not be enough.
That's right. So the answer to that is no. Now these questions were put together by Sister Stacy Hanrahan, who was there for the whole meeting. We had a number of people from NGOs who were over there and who were in the rooms with the delegates and who were very involved. Did it address sufficiently the plight of the poorest countries? No, it did address the poor countries, and it said that there would be, what is it? I have to remember how many $1 billion set up in a fund for the poor countries. 100 billion, but it's non-binding. Okay? Was it a major step in publicly proclaiming that climate change is a global crisis? Yes, it did do that. Did it convince leaders that climate change is progressing faster than predicted? Yes. Did the Paris Agreement move us forward to facing up to our responsibility to act? Well, we certainly hope so. But, as you mentioned, and of course everybody now is doing the buts, I guess, you do a little bit of celebration and then everybody starts saying what is not accomplished and what needs to be done. So it's a voluntary agreement at this point. Now on April 22nd, there will be a ceremony at the UN and countries will sign on to the agreement. That's Earth Day, in case you don't remember. And so at that point they will make their commitment. But it's still voluntary. Nobody can force them to do it. And so that's where civil societies, where the NGOs, where we come in. Because we have to hold the governments to their promises, to their commitments. So we have to continue to press for greater reduction. So we could say now begins our work. And the question is, what will you do? What will I do? And then we have another video.
It is a moment of truth.
The Paris Agreement is adopted.
Weather, drought, floods, those are things that we can't turn our back on.
There is a complete absence of a plan to get us countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of this century.
When I say indigenous, you say right! Right!
We know that Exxon lied.
We have the solutions. You need to listen.
We can build a safer future for everyone if we go 100% renewable energy.
All eyes are on us.
So the rest is up to us. People who were at the meeting said that in the course of the meeting, they stopped talking maybe so much about climate change as system change. And so we need to change the system for our energy, and so that would make a big impact. I guess that's it. Do you have questions? You know, one thing that is true is that wherever you have human beings, you're going to have something that's less than perfect. So many of us really want the UN to be perfect, and it would be nice if it were. But people in other countries, I know that there's a lot of corruption. In Guatemala's had terrible corruption. Tanzania's had terrible corruption. You know, and it is unfortunate, and I don't mean to excuse anybody, but it saddens us all. But that's where, in some sense, if you don't abide by those corruption ideas, you need to stand up and make sure that somebody is speaking for the values that you do have. So that's why we come to the UN. Okay? Somebody needs to speak for the Catholic Christian values, the dignity of person, over consumption, sustainability over profit. Well, you know, like I say, I did listen to the Security Council a couple months ago when it was first announced that Russia was going to start bombing, and then I listened to all the speeches, and you wonder, like I say, how is there ever going to be any kind of coming together? But actually, to tell you the truth, after I heard everybody speak, I was amazed that they were able to come to some kind of agreement. So the UN does continue to meet with leaders and try to get them to see some commonalities, and it's a slow process. But the UN is very involved. The UN is involved in terms of one of the things that I wanted to mention, I forgot, you know, did you see those starving children in Syria? And the UN tries to get aid into people. Now that's at a little different level than the governments, but they're trying to hold this meeting. Wasn't there supposed to be a meeting Monday or something? But now they can't agree on who all's going to be there or something. So, you know, so the UN is involved. But again, if you and the girl next to you have diametrically opposed ideas, and you won't sit down at the table and talk to one another, doesn't matter how much I want you to agree and how much I can put forth things. You know, you have to have something yourself that you're willing to do. Well, I think the UN has really been trying to, you know, again, encourage people to be inclusive. You know, that's something. And you know, the United Nations wasn't always that way itself. And I have a brother who will point out to me, the United Nations used to do this and this. Well, the United Nations has learned a lot, too, about how to work with people and how to bring people along. And so Ban Ki-moon really does try to do that. And I don't see how he can keep up with all the meetings he goes to and all the efforts he makes and all the things that he tries to do in order to get people to talk to one another. But ultimately, like I said, it's not up to him. So he keeps encouraging. He keeps, and it's more than encouragement. He has facts. He has information. He has insight. He is very knowledgeable, you know, and so he can present these. And even though people may have arguments, he has the information there that counteracts it. So hopefully, when people go away from such a gathering, you know, they think about some of that and realize that they need to change, and then they can come back and do something. Now, the Palestine-Israel situation's been going on for how long? You know, and the United Nations has tried to, but again, it hasn't been totally successful, has it? Let's see. Okay, one of the things that has been discussed at the UN is the fact that the veto of the Security Council, and in fact, in some instances where there's been genocide, there's been a veto. And this is something that people say is contrary to the values of the UN, the value of life, you know, which is written into the Charter. And so there are efforts to say you cannot veto anything that really affects human life like that. So again, hopefully that's going to be changed, and it will enable the UN to move forward on some of these issues that are so critical with human life.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Well, you're great.